On the 16th of December 1838, a schooner called the Royalist set sail from England to Singapore. Its owner, a former soldier called James Brooke, had put together a crew of old friends to go on an adventure in Southeast Asia, exploring the island of Borneo. It would be 9 years until he returned, and by that time he was no longer a private citizen. He had become the first of a series of rulers known as the White Rajahs of Sarawak, a de facto independent state on the island. This is the story of how James Brooke founded a dynasty that would last 100 years and a state that still exists today. James Brooke was born in 1803 in India and grew up in the holy city of Benares, also known as Varanasi. His family had been involved with India for generations, and his father, Thomas Brooke, had an uneventful although lucrative career in the service of the British East India Company, ending up as senior judge of the Court of Appeal. At the unusually late age of 12, James was sent to England to be educated, and was enrolled at the Norwich School. Things didn't go well there. He had a hard time coping with the strict discipline, and when he learned after a holiday that his best friend had gone to sea, he decided to run away. Shortly afterwards, his parents returned from India and gave the boy a private tutor instead. At the age of 16, he became an ensign in the Bengal Army of the East India Company. 3 years later, he had, doubtless through family influence, become Sub-Assistant Commissary General. He first saw action in war against the Burmese in 1825 and is mentioned on the 27th of January as having led a courageous and successful charge against the enemy. A few days later, he charged again and was shot in the lung. Initially assumed to have been killed, he was found on the battlefield and brought back to England to recover. Thereby, his active military career had come to an end, having lasted just 2 days. His convalescence would last 5 years, which is also the maximum amount of leave you are allowed to take from the East India Company. Having gotten well enough to sail, he raced back to resume his post in Calcutta, but the weather conspired against him, and in the city of Madras he realized that he wouldn't make it in time. Rather than to wait to be dismissed, he decided to resign and stayed on the Castle Huntly, the ship he had taken from England. He had already made good friends on board, and together they cruised onwards to Canton in China, enjoying a time of, quote, much merriment and vast foolery. Having returned to England, he settled down for a while in Bath, where he nearly got married to the daughter of a clergyman, but for unknown reasons the engagement was broken off. He found his new, comfortable and idle life to be boring and started to dream up all sorts of schemes. He got into politics and wanted to stand for parliament, but lacked the money. Then he planned to go whaling in Greenland, or maybe he should go to Australia instead and become a farmer. In the end, he decided to bring back his friends from the Castle Huntly and go on a trading voyage in Southeast Asia. After much convincing, his father, who had once bought an elephant for another of his sons, now agreed to buy James a brig and merchandise to sell. And so he was ready to depart for his adventure. But James had no talent as a merchant, and the trip was a disaster. The ship, along with its cargo, ended up being sold at a heavy loss in Macau, after which he returned empty-handed to England. Then, at the end of 1835, his father, Thomas Brooke, passed away, leaving James with a large inheritance which he would use to fund a second expedition. Within a few months, he had bought the Royalist, and together with his old friends, set sail for the East once again. He was driven by the love of adventure, but also the urge for distinction and a vague sense of social duty. Writing to the Athenaeum Club in London, he brought attention to the persistence of slavery and paganism in the East, against which he claimed not a single voice is upraised, and also spoke of the need to reassert British claims and resist Dutch influence in the area. His voyage was more limited in scope though, with the goal of exploring the island of Borneo. Located at the heart of maritime Southeast Asia, Borneo is the third largest island in the world, and is covered by thick rainforests with low-lying plains along the coasts and rugged mountains in the interior. By the early 19th century, the island was still a mysterious place to Europeans and known mostly for piracy and headhunting. The Dutch were beginning to expand their control over its southern part, whereas the north remained ruled by the Sultanate of Brunei. On his arrival in Singapore, Brooke was asked by the Chamber of Commerce to deliver a letter of thanks and gifts to a man called Hasim, who had recently helped some shipwrecked sailors. He was the oldest uncle of the Sultan of Brunei and was the heir presumptive, or Raja Muda. Since he was stationed in a place called Sarawak, that's where James went first. The area in question was located in the southwestern corner of the Sultanate and had in recent years become of great interest to the government because of the discovery of antimony there. This ore was used by locals as a cosmetic, but was also sought after by Westerners who turned it more brutally into type metal, tin cans, and bullets. Because of this, Brunei was attempting to reassert central control over Sarawak, while the locals, likely with foreign support, were staging a rebellion in response. Hasim, who had been sent down to deal with the uprising, gave a warm welcome to James and his crew, but realizing that the conflict prevented him from exploring upriver, he decided to come back the next year when he hoped travel would be secure. This didn't end up being the case, and on his second visit, Hasim managed to convince him to help put down the uprising. The Raja Muda had even brought up the possibility of handing over the area to Brooke in exchange for help, but after the rebels were defeated, he refused to discuss the topic any further, leading Brooke to become increasingly frustrated with him. The recently defeated locals realized that this rift between the two men could be used to regain their independence, and since Brooke had treated them well, they sent a delegation requesting that he become their Raja, offering to support him by force of arms. Then, as tensions were rising, a steamer owned by the East India Company happened to stop by on its way to help a shipwrecked crew, which conveniently made it seem as if Brooke had the support of the British Empire as well. While the visit was still fresh in the memory of Hasim, Brooke marched up to his residence at the head of 200 armed Malays and put forward a number of grievances against the local governor, Makota, who was made out to be tyrannical and disloyal to Hasim. Makota had to be deposed, and James insisted that he should take over as ruler. Hasim gave in to the pressure, and on the 24th of September 1841, James Brooke was publicly declared Rajah of Sarawak. A year later, his position was confirmed by the Sultan. He was still expected to pay tax to Brunei, but apart from that, he was essentially an independent ruler. So, what was he planning to do with this country, and how did he want to rule? From his experience growing up in India, James knew exactly what he didn't want to do. In his mind, British India was too large and too bureaucratic. Control was maintained through military force rather than personal loyalty, and the East India Company only cared about maintaining the flow of trade and profits. In Sarawak, he wanted to do something different, and a big inspiration for him was Stamford Raffles. Best known as the founder of Singapore, he had also ruled the island of Java for the British and had written a book about his time there, which James had read with great enthusiasm. In it, Raffles appealed as the enlightened and affectionate ruler of an island whose inhabitants he admired and whose well-being he saw as the only justification for empire. So, rather than to exploit the locals and impose change from the outside, Brooke wanted to work within Sarawak's political system and develop the country for the benefit of its people. He put it as follows: "The experiment of developing a country through the residence of a few Europeans and by the assistance of its native rulers has never been fairly tried, and it appears to me in some respects more desirable than the actual possession of a foreign nation. For if successful, the native prince finds greater advantages, and if a failure, the European government is not committed. Above all, it ensures the independence of the native princes, and may advance the inhabitants further in the scale of civilization by means of the very independence than can be done when the government is a foreign one, and their natural freedom sacrificed." With these ideals in mind, he set about governing Sarawak. The country was very small, about twice the size of Luxembourg, but inhabited by several different ethnic groups. The Muslim Malays lived in coastal areas and controlled the flow of trade between the interior and the global market. Having helped him rise to power, James was quick to reinstate their leaders to the positions they had held before the rebellion, and would in large part rule through them. There were also many Chinese merchants and miners, and he would encourage increased Chinese immigration to help develop the country's resources. Finally, the interior was inhabited by the many indigenous tribes of Borneo, referred to collectively as Dayaks. The two main groups living in Sarawak were the Sea Dayaks, or Iban, who were known as fierce raiders and headhunters, and the Land Dayaks, or Bidayu, who were generally more peaceful but suffered brutal exploitation by the Malays and Iban peoples. Brooke's policy would be to pacify the former and protect the latter. The capital, Kuching, was situated by the Sarawak River and was at the time still a modest collection of thatched houses built on poles. His own residence, which had been put up by Hasim, was large and imposing, but many corners had been cut during its construction, and James estimated that the whole thing would come crumbling down within a year. He was clearly onto something, because one day he fell straight through its floor, nearly drowning in the tidal water below. Nonetheless, the house was important for the early administration of Sarawak. This was where he held court proceedings, and James also established the custom of receiving petitioners after dinner here, opening up his doors to anyone who wanted to speak with him, rich or poor, Malay, Dayak, or Chinese. He didn't just rule from his house though, and soon started traveling into the interior to personally meet with the Badayan tribes. He convinced most of them to submit to his authority and start paying an annual rice tax in exchange for protection against the Malays and Iban. As news of his ability to protect them spread, other Dayaks from neighboring regions started to move into Sarawak as well. But not everyone went along with this. The powerful Singi tribe still supported the former governor Makota and put up resistance, but was ultimately defeated and had their chieftain replaced by one loyal to Brooke. Even the tribes that nominally accepted his rule would prove a headache to him though, since they were constantly downplaying the size of their communities in order to pay as little tax as possible. At the time, there was no easy way to verify their claims, and collecting taxes became a slow and arduous process. In general, finding enough money to pay for his government would be difficult, and in the end he was forced to use what remained of his father's fortune to make the country stay afloat, leaving him more or less broke for the rest of his life. In some cases, James would also struggle to live up to his espoused ideals. In the lead-up to the second expedition, he had been vocal about the persistence of slavery in the East, but now, as ruler, he was faced with the reality that abolishing the practice would likely mean political suicide, and decided to leave it unresolved. Instead, he set to work on two other projects that would become the major justifications of his reign: the eradication of piracy and of headhunting. The coast of northern Borneo was plagued by Malay, Iban, as well as Ilanon pirates from the Philippines. James had a lot of success in his fight against them and managed to convince British naval captains to help as well. Steps were also taken to stop headhunting, which was an important part of Dayak and especially Iban culture. For example, dried heads were needed for the decent burials of prominent men and for marriage. The practice was quickly banned, but there was a catch. The ban could be lifted in times of war, and in this way demand for heads could still be satisfied to some degree, while James could easily gather large numbers of Dayak warriors for his campaigns, something that would soon come in handy. Warnings had been sent out to his neighbors that raids against Sarawak would no longer be permitted, but some Dayak tribes under Malay leaders, notably the Iban of the Scrung and Sarabas rivers, continued anyway. This prompted him to launch a series of campaigns to pacify them and gradually expand his territory eastwards. Meanwhile, he was seeking to increase his influence in Brunei and to strengthen the position of the pro-British faction there. As part of this move, he sent Hasim back to the capital of the Sultanate, positioning him to one day inherit the country. Reluctantly, he also sent Hasim's younger brother Badruddin as support. James and Badruddin had for a time been practically inseparable and were so close that many modern historians believe that they had a romantic relationship. But in 1846, Hasim and most of his brothers were assassinated by order of the Sultan. Badruddin was one of the victims. He was attacked in the middle of the night and was outnumbered by 40 of the Sultan's followers against his 3 guards. While trying to defend the entrance to his house, Badruddin was shot and seriously wounded. He then retired to the inner apartments where he commanded a slave boy called Jafar to spread out gunpowder across the floor. Then he handed him a ring, a gift from James, and told the boy to bring it to him, to tell James what had happened, and, quote, that my last thoughts were of my true friend, Mr. Brooke. Shortly after escaping the house, Jafar heard a loud explosion, telling him that the prince had set fire to the powder rather than fall into the hands of his enemies. At the end of his life, James would write about Badruddin that, my love for him was deeper than anyone I knew. Furious and heartbroken, Brooke persuaded the British to send a fleet to Brunei, which seized the capital, forcing the Sultan to flee into the jungle. After some time, he returned and agreed to apologize for the killings and cede the island of Labuan to the British to serve as a coaling station. James was also allowed to mine coal and given renewed assurances of his right to rule Sarawak, but he failed to re-establish a friendly faction in the court. Nonetheless, the next year he returned triumphantly to England. He had been away for 9 years, and it came as a bit of a shock to find that he was now famous. Parts of his journals had been published and had brought the quote wild fun of his campaigns to a wide audience. He was showered with honors, and all doors were now open to him, allowing him to talk about and promote Sarawak. The government appointed him Consul General for Borneo, which came with a large salary, and finally he was granted an audience with Queen Victoria, who had him knighted and named as governor of the new colony he had urged the British government to found at Labuan. But his reputation wouldn't remain spotless forever. After 4 months, James sailed back to Sarawak and continued his campaigns in the east, consolidating power by constructing forts along the local rivers. The interior was still controlled by the fierce warrior Rentap, who would resist Brooke rule for many years to come. But with the lowland practically already a part of Sarawak, the area was officially ceded by Brunei in 1853 on the condition that its revenues would be shared with the Sultan. While this was happening, criticism against James Brooke began to appear back in England. Around the time of his last visit, he had a falling out with his London agent, Henry Wise, over his plans to establish a company at considerable advantage to himself with rights to exploit Sarawak's natural resources. James would always have a country gentry dislike of modern metropolitan businessmen like Wise, who wanted to make lots of quick money. He was protective of his country's resources and suspected that another's profit would be theft from the local Sarawakians. So, having originally lobbied in James's favor, Wise now began to plot his downfall, publishing new parts of his journals selected to make him look as bad as possible. In part fueled by this, a campaign was then launched by the Liberal opposition, accusing him of excessive use of force against natives. James had claimed that the Iban he was fighting against were pirates, and in this way he'd been able to enlist the help of the British Navy, who had a mandate to suppress piracy in the region. But were they really? Since water was the universal means of transport in Borneo, robbers, rebels, and outlaws could all conveniently disappear under the classification of pirate. The lack of British casualties was invoked as proof that this was no normal warfare but a one-sided massacre. In one battle, the enemy had lost 100 boats and 500 men against 14 locals on the Sarawak side. Additionally, some 2,000 enemies had simply been allowed to escape. James could have easily had them killed, but decided not to, in the hope that they would spread the word of what had happened, and contented himself with burning their stronghold. This, it was argued, meant that they must have been harmless sailors, otherwise, had they really been pirates, they would surely have been hanged. Far from a benign ruler, James was beginning to be portrayed as a bloodthirsty tyrant who used the navy to slaughter harmless natives so that he could seize their land. It was said that James Brooke might act like St. George, but he himself did not believe in the dragon. All of this culminated in a commission of inquiry held in Singapore in 1854 with the goal of clearing things up and determining whether his conduct had been such as his becoming a servant of the British Crown. 2 judges were present and both agreed that the Scrung and Sarabas Dayaks were pirates, but the question of whether excessive force had been used against them remained unresolved. So the allegations continued to haunt the Raja and over time contributed to make him ever more embittered and paranoid. He believed that the investigation had been a farce, and having already resigned as governor of Labuan in 1852, he now relinquished his remaining crown offices in protest. Writing about the controversy, he noted that, quote, "I've been held up as a prodigy of perfection, and I've been cast down as a monster of iniquity." Following his return from the commission, a period of relative calm began in Sarawak. James, who thrived off of adventure, wrote, quote, "We are quite prosperous and quiet, dull as a ditch water." He made time pass by practicing playing chess and often spent weekends in one of his country retreats debating topics like religion, science, or politics with his friends. In the morning, they would find each other looking for sources in the library to support another discussion in the evening. A welcome addition to their group was the famous naturalist and explorer Alfred Russel Wallace, who was then in the process of conceiving the theory of evolution independently of Darwin. James's invitation to Sarawak had helped Wallace decide on the Malay archipelago for his next expedition, which lasted for 8 years and established him as one of the foremost intellectuals of the Victorian era. The calm would come to an abrupt end in 1857 in an event that nearly led to the downfall of Brooke's Raj. In the early hours of the 19th of February, the population of Kuching was awakened by shouts and screams and the firing of guns as 600 armed Chinese gold miners descended on the city. They had come downriver from a settlement called Bao and were members of a Kong Si, something like a combination of a republic and a corporation with democratically elected leaders. Although located in Sarawak, it functioned as a de facto independent state and resisted attempts by Brooke to control and tax them. Recently, they'd seen how the Dutch succeeded in destroying the Kongsis across the border in western Borneo, and as Brooke's attempts to control the Bao community became ever more serious, they came to the conclusion that they were next, and that they would need to take over Sarawak if they wanted to maintain their freedom. The surprise and scale of the attack were overwhelming, and by daylight the Chinese leaders controlled the town. James had been woken up by the commotion and in panic escaped out the back of his house, swimming undetected to the opposite shore of the river where he collapsed, exhausted from malaria. Illness wasn't the only reason for his lack of fighting spirit. 5 days earlier, he admitted to being in that sort of state which makes life less bright. He was too tired or depressed to dine with his bishop as arranged, and even cancelled a planned trip to his outer territories. The cause for this melancholy was reports that his illegitimate son Reuben, whom he'd been trying for more than 2 years to trace, had been killed. Now, on top of that, it seemed as if everything he'd worked for in Sarawak was lost. After some time, he got up from the muddy bank of the river and made his way to safety, where an onlooker described him as utterly depressed and hopeless. But it wasn't over for him yet. As the Chinese marauded on the streets of Kuching, attacking first European government offices and then the general population, the Malays put up fierce resistance, and in the following days reinforcements arrived. More loyalist Malays and Bidayu came down from the inland, and Iban from Skrang and Sarabas travelled from the east. Crucially, a steamship was also provided by the Borneo Company, which had recently been founded to develop Sarawak. With all this support, the city was quickly retaken, and the Chinese forced to flee across the border to the Dutch-controlled Sultanate of Sambas. Burdened by their families and their considerable loot, they were harried relentlessly, and up to 2,000 lost their lives in the insurrection. Many heads were taken by the Dayaks, and indiscriminate reprisals were carried out against Chinese communities by the Malays. Despite all of this bloodshed, though, the event led James to regain some of his lost popularity in the English press. The worst-case scenario had been averted, but the uprising was still a disaster for the Raj. Kuching had been reduced to a pile of rubble, and the Sarawakian economy lay in tatters. In the following years, the government struggled to maintain a surplus of revenue and was in urgent need of new sources of income. The most promising one was the trade in sago, a starch extracted from palm trees which are centered around the Rajang River basin in nominally Brunei-controlled territory. The Raja had begun to extend his influence over the area already around 1850, and now he pushed for a complete annexation of it, which was realized by 1861. Again, the Sultan of Brunei was convinced to cede the territory in exchange for a share of the profits. The takeover wasn't accomplished without resistance, however. In 1859, one of Brooke's forts along the Rajang River in a place called Kanowit had been attacked. Its commanders, Steele and Fox, were killed in what was interpreted as part of a widespread Malay conspiracy to overthrow the Rajah's power. The culprits were identified as the prominent noble Abdul Ghaffur and Sharif Masahor, a local ruler in the Rajang Basin whose power Brooke was encroaching on. Sometime after the incident, he was apprehended traveling with a group of armed men towards Kuching, and fearing a repeat of the Chinese uprising, the force was ambushed and defeated. Masahor escaped to Brunei and Ghaffur was exiled. As the years went on, Brooke spent more and more of his time in England, retiring to a small cottage in Devonshire. Sarawak was left in the hands of his nephew John, who was also supposed to take over as Rajah one day. In the latter 1850s, however, their relationship began to disintegrate. As it turned out, James's son, Reuben, was actually alive, and the Rajah acknowledged him and wanted to give him a position in Sarawak. Despite assurances that he was still the heir, this was seen as a threat by John. More importantly though, James was having doubts about the viability of his fragile country as an independent state. For most of his reign, he tried to make Sarawak a protectorate, or at least a moral responsibility of the British Empire to secure its defense. But recently, he leaned more towards completely ceding the country as a colony and began negotiating an agreement. As with all things he did as Rajah, he claimed and probably also believed that what he was doing was in the best interest of his people, although this time the Sarawakians definitely would have disagreed. He even admitted as much in a letter to his nephew, writing that if the matter were referred to the Sarawak people, the party who espoused the rejection of all protection would win their vote. John found it unacceptable that his uncle would try to sell Sarawak from under him and betray the natives who had placed their trust in him. In 1862, he finally declared his open defiance, writing, "Rajah, you must blame yourself that you have forgotten that Brooke blood runs in my veins as well as in your own. You have overstrained the bow of my patience, and it is broken at last. We must try our relative strength now, and all I can say is that if I prove the stronger, I shall always bear in mind that you were the founder of Sarawak, that you are my relative, and that for many years you were my friend." Enraged by this betrayal, James sailed off to Asia and met with John in Singapore the next year, avoiding a confrontation on Sarawak soil. The meeting was tense, and the hatred between the two men was now so strong that it was described as very unpleasant to be even witness in it. John could not prevent his uncle from continuing to Sarawak, but sure of his own popularity, he believed that the Rajah will not be able to do much mischief, and agreed to travel to England where he hoped to build support for his position. But the Rajah did manage to take back control and turn public opinion in his favour. He denied having negotiated to cede the country to a foreign power and assured the people that he would not attempt to change Sarawak's status without the agreement of its Supreme Council. In April, the Rajah decreed that John was relieved of all his authority, and in July he was banished from the country. Were he ever to return, he was to be cut down on the spot. When asked about who would be the new heir, James answered vaguely that he had appointed a friend whom he could trust. This concealed the fact that as a temporary measure, he had made one of the richest women in England, Angela Burdett Coutts, his successor. The two were very close friends, and being an admirer of James's work in Sarawak, she had provided important financial support to him. But it was John's younger brother, Charles, who was eventually named as successor. After a stay that had lasted 6 months, James Brooke left Sarawak for the last time in September 1863. His remaining years would be spent visiting friends and engaging in country pursuits in England. He largely retired to his cottage in Devonshire, but maintained a stream of letters to Sarawak. He also participated in local affairs in his village and was known for his charity and approachability. On Christmas Eve 1867, he suffered a stroke, followed by another one the next summer. He passed away on the 11th of June 1868, aged 65, and was laid to rest in Sheepstore Church near his home. He had once told his nephew John that if he died in England, he wanted his heart to be buried in Sarawak. This wish was never realized, but a belief soon appeared that the Rajah's soul had returned to Sarawak to inhabit the peak of Mount Santubong near the capital and safeguard the country. As planned, Charles Brooke took over as Rajah of Sarawak. Having arrived in the country in 1852, he spent much of his life with the Iban people, learning their language and gaining a great respect for their customs and beliefs. Under his reign, the country continued to expand until reaching its modern borders, leaving Brunei with a piece of land only slightly larger than what James Brooke had been granted by them back in 1841. Charles also managed to finally secure a deal with the British, making Sarawak a protectorate in 1888. This meant that the country now had official defense guarantees while maintaining its autonomy. Meanwhile, infrastructure was being built, and especially in the latter years of his reign, the economy was taking off, driven by the expansion of agriculture and the discovery of oil. Charles remained in power until his death in 1917 at the age of 87. His oldest son, Charles Vyner Brooke, would become the third and last of the White Rajahs of Sarawak. He ruled together with his brother Bertram and generally took a hands-off approach to running the country. A boom in rubber and oil allowed for the country's institutions to be modernized. Public services were developed, a Sarawak penal code modeled on that of British India was introduced in 1924, and the educational system was somewhat improved. Most notably though, at the centenary of Brooke rule in 1941, Charles Vyner proclaimed a new constitution that would limit the power of the Rajah and allow the Sarawak people to play a greater role in the functioning of the government. However, later that same year, the Japanese invaded Sarawak, beginning an occupation that would last until 1945. When it was finally liberated, Charles Vyner lacked the resources to rebuild the war-torn country and decided to cede sovereignty of Sarawak to the British Crown. A cession bill narrowly passed through a vote in the Supreme Council, mostly supported by European officers, and turned the country into a British colony. An anti-cession movement arose in protest, which, in a repeat of history, was supported by Charles's estranged nephew and heir, Anthony Brooke. But it was mostly suppressed by 1950. In 1963, self-government was established, and on the 16th of September that year, Sarawak co-founded the Federation of Malaysia, of which it remains a state to this day.